A young black lawyer takes on the case of a homeless man accused of a crime he didn't commit, only to discover, in the middle of the trial, that he's the father she thought she'd lost forever. As secrets unravel and the lines between justice and betrayal blur, she must decide, will she fight for the truth, even if it tears her apart? Or will this case destroy them both? The truth is deeper than anyone imagined. Stay with us to see how this emotional, suspense-filled journey unfolds. Like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories. The late-night call interrupted her, just when Laura thought the day was finally winding down. It was one of those calls that could change everything, a whisper of something urgent, something that couldn't wait until morning. "Laura, we need you down here, now," the voice on the other end said, tense and clipped. The words sent a shockwave through her. Laura Davis, a young black attorney, had worked tirelessly to get to where she was, a rising star at a prestigious firm with a future that seemed clear. But there was something in the tone of her senior partner's voice that made her stomach churn. Something was off. She rushed to the office, the flickering lights of the city casting long shadows on the empty streets. When she arrived, she was met with a case that would set her on a collision course with her own past. A homeless man had been accused of a violent crime. He was found at the scene, covered in blood, with no alibi and no witnesses. The case seemed straightforward, too straightforward. "He's not just any homeless man," her partner said. "This one has ties to people higher up. We're taking it because it's high profile. Win this, and you'll be untouchable." But there was something in the man's eyes, something familiar. As she stared at the defendant, she felt a chill run through her. She couldn't place it. Laura entered the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step echoing in her ears like the ticking of a clock. The room was heavy with anticipation, the weight of the case hanging in the air. She had only just begun to process the implications of her new assignment, representing a homeless man accused of a brutal crime, but she had no idea how personal this case would become. Her defendant, Michael Banks, sat at the table, his hands shackled to the chair. His face was weathered by years of neglect and hardship. His eyes, though, were sharp, clear and focused, as if nothing about his situation could ever dim his awareness. He met her gaze as she approached, and Laura felt a jolt run through her. There was something about him, something too familiar. He didn't look up as Laura pulled a chair beside him and sat down, flipping through the case file. His silence spoke volumes, and she couldn't help but wonder if he knew what she was thinking. Was he aware of the strange connection she felt toward him? "You don't have to do this," Michael said, his voice rough, a mixture of defeat and defiance. "The case! You don't owe me anything." His words cut through her thoughts like a knife. It was true. She didn't owe him anything. In fact, if she had her way, she would have taken on any other case. But this one was different. She couldn't quite put her finger on why, but there was something about him that tugged at her, something about his story, his wearied soul that called to her. "I know you don't think you have a chance," she said quietly, not meeting his gaze. "But I'll fight for you. You deserve better than this. You deserve a chance." He finally looked up at her, a glimmer of something, a flash of recognition, flickered in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a hardened stare. "You don't know anything about me, girl. What makes you think you can save me?" Laura's chest tightened. The bluntness of his words stung, but she could see beneath the anger and the resistance. There was a man who had been broken by life, by the system, and by his own choices. And yet, he didn't give up. He still held on to a shred of pride, however small. "I may not know everything," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "but I know enough to see you don't deserve to be here." Michael chuckled bitterly. "You don't get it. You don't understand the system. No one does. I'm just another face in the crowd to them. Just another black man caught up in the cycle. You think a lawyer can change that?" The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Michael didn't just talk about the system, he knew it. He was too aware of how it worked, too resigned to it. He had seen how it chewed up people like him, People with no power, no money, no family. And in that moment, Laura knew that winning the case wasn't just about law. It was about fighting an entire system that didn't see people like Michael as human. Her heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to maintain composure. "I don't have all the answers," she said softly, "but I can help you fight, and that's what matters." Michael shook his head, the sadness in his eyes undeniable. "You don't know what it's like, to be forgotten, to not matter." Laura's throat tightened. She did know what it was like to feel invisible. As a black woman in a predominantly white law firm, she had fought for every inch of recognition, every opportunity to prove herself. She understood the loneliness of being the only one who looked like you in a room full of people who didn't see you. But Michael's pain was different. His invisibility came from decades of abuse, neglect, and being reduced to nothing but a statistic. "I know more than you think," she whispered, "but I won't let them forget you." There was a brief silence between them, heavy and thick. She wanted to say more, to tell him that there was more to him than this case, more to him than the past that haunted him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, dismantling the case against him. She had no choice. The system had already decided who he was, and it was up to her to prove them wrong. The case against Michael Banks seemed airtight. The police had found him at the scene of the crime, covered in blood. Witnesses had identified him, and the forensic evidence appeared damning. As Laura sat in her office, reviewing the files, the weight of it all pressed down on her. Every lead seemed to circle back to a dead end. Her mind kept returning to Michael's face, the eyes that, for just a moment, seemed so familiar. There was something there, something that tugged at her, like a distant memory she couldn't quite reach. She had spoken with a few key witnesses, neighbors, a local barista who had served Michael coffee for years, and an officer who had known him from previous arrests. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about him, most of it negative. He was just another derelict, troublemaker, lost cause. But every single person who described him seemed to do so with the same detached cruelty that she had seen in her firm's attitudes toward people like him. The more Laura dug into Michael's background, the more she realized how much he had been failed by the system. A series of unfortunate events, a failed foster care system, poverty, substance abuse, had led him to the streets. But none of that excused his current situation. The charges against him were unjust, and the system had already sentenced him to a life of criminality without offering any chance for redemption. And then, something in the police report caught her eye, a small detail she had overlooked earlier. Michael had been a soldier. The discovery made her pause. She flipped through more files, tracking down his military records. She had heard the rumors, how Michael had been a hero once, a man with potential who had gone to war and returned broken. But no one had ever mentioned this in the case. No one had bothered to investigate the man behind the label. Her mind raced. Could this man, the one everyone had dismissed, actually be someone who had been pushed to the edge by a system that didn't care? And if so, could she possibly get him out of this mess? The answer was no longer clear-cut. For the first time since she'd taken on the case, Laura began to wonder whether she was defending a man with a dark past, or a man who had been a victim of that very past. As the days passed, Laura became consumed by the case. She visited shelters, spoke with homeless advocates, and tried to piece together Michael's life. She found that his story wasn't just about the crime he was accused of. It was about a lifetime of broken promises, forgotten people, and a system that had abandoned him. But the deeper Laura dug, the more confusing things became. She learned about Michael's service in the military, about how he had been deployed overseas and came back a different person, scarred, lost, unable to reconnect with the life he had left behind. She discovered a chain of foster homes, each one more abusive and neglectful than the last, leading to a life on the streets. And then, one day, as she was going through old photographs in the military files, a picture caught her eye. It was an old black-and-white image from the war, Michael, standing tall in uniform, his expression strong, proud, and unbroken. But there was something else in the photo, a young woman standing beside him. Laura's breath caught in her throat. The woman in the photo looked like her. Same dark eyes, same features. It was impossible, yet the resemblance was undeniable. The puzzle pieces began to fall into place and Laura's heart raced. Could this be the same man? Was Michael her father? She had always believed her father was dead. Her mother had told her he had left them when she was just a baby. But now, standing in front of the photograph, Laura felt a deep shiver of realization. The pieces of her life were no longer fitting together the way she thought they would. The man she had been taught to hate, the man who had abandoned her, might be the very man she was trying to save. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the discovery. Michael Banks, the homeless man she had been defending, was more than just a case. He was her father. The world felt like it was spinning, the edges of her thoughts blurring together. Laura sat frozen in her office, staring at the photograph of Michael and the woman who looked so much like her. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. He could be my father. How could this be? Her mind raced, trying to fit the pieces together, but it didn't make sense. Her mother had always told her that her father had abandoned them, that he had left without a word. She had believed it, accepted it. But the man sitting in front of her, the homeless man accused of a crime he didn't commit, was not just a defendant. He was family. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched the photograph tightly, as if it could somehow provide the answers she desperately needed. Was this why I felt that strange connection to him? She wondered. Why his eyes seemed so familiar. But if he was her father, why hadn't he ever tried to find her? Why had he disappeared from her life completely? There were more questions than answers, and the thought of confronting Michael, of confronting this truth, terrified her. What would it mean for everything she believed about herself, her family, and her life's work? The decision to confront him weighed heavily on her. She wasn't just his lawyer anymore. She was connected to him in a way she hadn't expected, and that was a complication she wasn't sure she was prepared for. Her emotions, her duty as an attorney, and the confusion swirling in her mind all collided, leaving her disoriented and unsure of what to do next. The next morning, Laura arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. She had spent the night unable to sleep, replaying the events in her mind, wondering what Michael would say if she asked him about the photograph, if she asked him about the truth. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to know. As she approached the holding cells to meet with Michael, her heart hammered in her chest. Her thoughts were scattered. Was she supposed to approach him as a lawyer or as a daughter? Could she separate her emotions from the case, or would her personal connection cloud her judgment? When she entered the small room where Michael was waiting, he looked up at her, his gaze steady but unreadable. He had always been quiet, even distant. But now, there was an unspoken tension between them, something different in the air, something unspoken. "Michael," she began, her voice surprisingly calm despite the storm raging inside her. "There's something I need to ask you." He shifted in his seat, watching her with a mixture of suspicion and resignation. "What's that?" Laura swallowed, her throat dry. She hesitated, trying to find the right words, but the words didn't come. She placed the photograph on the table between them, letting it speak for itself. Michael's eyes flicked to the photo. He didn't flinch, didn't move. But something flickered in his expression just for a second, a recognition, an acknowledgement of something deep and painful. "Do you remember this?" Laura asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at his hands, his fingers playing with the edge of the table. Laura's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her breath, waiting for him to speak. Finally, he looked up at her, and his face softened slightly, though the shadows in his eyes remained. "I don't know why you're showing me this, Laura." Her heart skipped a beat. The way he said her name, Laura, as though it was a question, made her wonder just how much he knew, just how much he had been hiding from her. "Why didn't you ever try to find me?" she asked before she could stop herself. The question was raw, loaded with pain. For a moment, Michael didn't answer. He just stared at her, his face unreadable. Then, he finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "I didn't think you would want to know me, Laura. I didn't think you would want anything to do with a man like me. I wasn't good enough. I still don't feel good enough." The words cut through Laura like a blade, but there was something else in his voice. Regret, sorrow, the weight of a man who had carried a burden for far too long. "All these years," he continued, his voice trembling slightly, "I've been trying to forget everything. The choices I made, the things I did, the things I failed to do. I thought you were better off without me in your life. I thought you'd be better off not knowing the truth about me." Laura's heart twisted in her chest. She had always imagined her father as a figure who had abandoned her, someone who never cared. But now, hearing his voice, hearing his regrets, it was clear that he had been fighting his own battles, his own demons. He had never been given a chance to be the father she needed. "You didn't abandon me," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't have the chance." For a moment, they both just sat there in silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. Laura wasn't sure where to go from here. The truth was in front of her, undeniable, but the path forward felt so uncertain. The case against Michael was scheduled for trial in a few days. The evidence against him was damning, but Laura had uncovered something that might change everything. Michael's military records, his background, his struggles. She was beginning to see the man behind the accusation, the man who had been broken by a lifetime of hardship. She knew that to win this case, she had to fight harder than ever. But now, she wasn't just fighting for a stranger. She was fighting for her father, a man who had made mistakes, yes, but also a man who deserved redemption. The morning of the trial, Laura walked into the courtroom with a new resolve. She wasn't just there as a lawyer. She was there as someone who had discovered something about herself, something that would change her forever. As the proceedings began, she realized that this was no longer just about justice for Michael. It was about her own understanding of forgiveness, of family, and of what it really meant to fight for someone. As she stood before the jury, presenting her argument, she knew the stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about proving Michael's innocence. This was about healing old wounds, about showing that even the most broken among us could have a second chance. And as the trial progressed, as the twists and turns unfolded, Laura found herself not just defending Michael, she was fighting for the future they could still have together, a future that just a few weeks ago had seemed impossible. Just as the trial reached its peak, a bombshell piece of evidence surfaced. A witness who had been silent all along finally came forward with a shocking revelation, one that would change everything. But would it be enough to save Michael? Would it be enough to redeem the past? Laura's heart raced as she faced the unexpected twist, knowing that the final decision wasn't just about Michael anymore. It was about the future of her relationship with him, and the future of a family that had been lost for far too long. The courtroom was thick with tension as the surprise witness made their way to the stand. Laura's pulse quickened as she tried to keep her composure. She hadn't expected this. No one had. A figure from Michael's past, someone who had never spoken a word until now, stepped forward. The witness, a tall man with graying hair and a weathered face, cleared his throat and took his place in the witness box. He looked directly at Michael, his eyes filled with guilt and something else, a flicker of remorse, as if he had been carrying a secret for far too long. "I was with Michael when it happened," the man began, his voice shaky but determined. "I was the one who saw everything. I know what you're thinking, that this is some last-minute attempt to change the outcome, but it's the truth, and it's time it came out." Laura's mind spun. What could this man know? What could he have witnessed? "Michael didn't kill that man," the witness continued, his gaze never leaving Michael. "The real killer is someone else. Someone who's been covering their tracks for years. It wasn't Michael. He's innocent." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Laura could hardly believe her ears. How could this be true? The witness went on to explain that, years ago, Michael had been a part of a military operation that had gone terribly wrong. They had been ordered to take down a target, but the operation had been compromised. Innocent people had died, and Michael had been blamed for it. The man in the witness stand had been one of the soldiers who knew the truth but had kept quiet out of fear of retribution. The twist was as shocking as it was simple. The entire reason Michael had disappeared all those years ago was that he had been framed for something he didn't do. He hadn't abandoned Laura. He had been running from a lie that had cost him everything. As the witness detailed the events, it became clear that Michael had been a scapegoat in a much larger conspiracy involving high-ranking officials who had covered up the truth to protect their own interests. The room was silent as the weight of the revelation sank in. Laura felt a rush of conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, confusion. She wanted to scream at the injustice, to rail against the system that had taken so much from Michael, from her, but there was no time for that. The only thing that mattered now was the truth and how to use it to save him. The trial was no longer just about Michael's innocence. It was about exposing the larger conspiracy, about bringing justice to those who had manipulated the truth and destroyed lives. Laura knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't let this moment slip away. She turned to her legal team, her thoughts racing. The evidence they had, Michael's military records, the witness testimony, was powerful, but it needed to be presented with precision. There was no room for mistakes. The stakes were too high. Laura rose to her feet, her voice steady as she addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you've heard today is a glimpse into a truth that has been buried for far too long. Michael Davis is not the man you've been led to believe. He is not guilty of the crime he's accused of, and the real criminals have remained free for years, hiding behind a veil of lies and manipulation." Her words echoed through the courtroom, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Laura's eyes locked with Michael's, and she saw something in his gaze, a mixture of gratitude and something more. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the realization that, for the first time in years, he was being seen for who he truly was. "Today, we fight not just for Michael's innocence," Laura continued, "but for the truth to be heard, for justice to be served. The system failed him once. We will not let it fail him again." The jury sat in stunned silence, processing everything they had just heard. It was a gamble, but Laura knew she had no choice. She had to make them believe. Believe in Michael, believe in the power of redemption, and believe in the truth. After what felt like an eternity, the jury finally returned to the courtroom. The tension was unbearable. Laura's hands trembled as she stood at the defense table, waiting for the verdict. The room was packed with reporters, onlookers, and legal professionals, all eager to see how this unprecedented case would unfold. The judge called the courtroom to order, and the jury foreman stood up to deliver their verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Davis, not guilty of all charges." A collective gasp swept through the room. For a moment, Laura couldn't move. She had been so prepared for the worst, so certain that even the truth might not be enough to change things. But this was a victory. As the judge called for the court to be adjourned, Laura looked over at Michael, who stood there, his expression unreadable. Then, as the crowd began to file out, he turned to her, and for the first time since the trial began, he smiled. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save me. You saved everything I thought I had lost. You saved us." Laura's heart swelled as she realized how much this moment meant. She had come to the courthouse fighting for justice, but she was leaving with something far more profound. She had found the father she never knew, and in the process she had saved him. But she had also saved herself, her faith in truth, and her belief that redemption was possible, even for the most broken. As the days passed, Michael was finally able to return to a life outside the shadows. The media frenzy died down, and though the scars of his past would never fully fade, he was beginning to rebuild. Laura stayed by his side, not just as his lawyer, but as his daughter, something she hadn't been able to fully comprehend until now. The bond they had formed in the courtroom, forged in the fire of lies and secrets, was undeniable. They both had a long road ahead of them, one filled with healing and reconciliation. But they were no longer strangers. They were family, imperfect, but connected. One evening, as they sat together in a small diner, Michael turned to Laura, his eyes soft with gratitude. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought I'd get the chance to make things right with you, but here we are." Laura smiled, her heart full. "We're here, and that's what matters." They clinked their glasses together, a silent promise between them. No matter what, we move forward together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, Laura felt the weight of the past lifting. She had fought for Michael, fought for justice, and in the end, she had found more than she ever expected. She had found her father, and with that, she found the strength to keep fighting for what was right. As they left the diner, Michael's phone rang. His face darkened as he answered, his voice low and cautious. "Yes, I understand. I'll be there soon." Laura looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. Something about the way his shoulders tensed told her that this wasn't over yet. "Who was that?" she asked. Michael paused, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "Someone from my past. Someone who doesn't want us to be happy, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want." The phone call hung heavily in the air. Michael's expression was unreadable, but Laura could sense the unease radiating from him. She instinctively reached for his arm, her eyes wide with concern. "Who was that?" she asked again, her voice firm but soft. Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, trying to compose himself. The tension in his posture was palpable. Finally, he spoke, his voice tinged with a mixture of fear and regret. "It's someone from my past. Someone who wants something I can't give, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it." Laura felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The calm, collected man she had come to know in the courtroom now seemed fragile, vulnerable. She had seen the strength in him, but now she saw the weight of years spent running, hiding, keeping secrets. This was a man who had learned to survive, but who had never truly lived. "You don't have to face this alone," she said, her words a steady reassurance. "Whatever it is, we'll deal with it together." Michael's eyes softened as he looked at her, but the shadow of his past was still very much alive in him. "They won't stop until they get what they want," he muttered, his voice low. "And what they want is me. For the mistakes I made all those years ago, I've tried to bury it, but it's always been there." Over the next few days, Laura and Michael dug deeper into the mystery behind the phone call. They began to uncover clues about a dangerous figure from Michael's past, someone who had been connected to the military operation that had gone wrong years ago. This person, a former high-ranking officer named Colonel Victor Reynolds, had been the one who orchestrated the cover-up. As they delved into Reynolds's background, they discovered that he had been pulling strings from behind the scenes, using his power to silence anyone who knew the truth about the botched mission. Reynolds had been untouchable, his hands clean, his motives buried under layers of lies. But Michael was not the only one who had been left in the wake of this dark history. Several other soldiers from the operation had vanished or been killed under mysterious circumstances. Laura realized that Michael wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting to expose a larger conspiracy that could bring down powerful people. "Reynolds has been controlling everything from the shadows," Laura said one evening, her voice filled with resolve. "But we have the truth now. It's time to expose him for who he really is." Laura and Michael knew they couldn't take this battle to court without the right evidence. They needed to find Reynolds, bring him to the surface, and force him into the light. But finding him wasn't going to be easy. The man had spent years covering his tracks, making sure that no one could trace him. Their first step was to visit the military archives, searching for any documentation that might shed light on Reynolds's involvement in the mission. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. Late one night, in the dim glow of the library's computer screen, Laura found something that made her heart race. A hidden file. It had been classified for years, but with the right permissions, she could open it. The document detailed Reynolds's role in the cover-up and named several high-ranking officials who had been involved in silencing the soldiers who knew too much. "This is it," Laura whispered, her hand trembling as she printed the pages. "This is the evidence we need to bring him down." But just as she was about to gather the documents and leave, she heard a noise, a creak of a door opening, footsteps in the hallway. "Michael," she whispered urgently, "we need to go, now." They grabbed the papers and fled, narrowly escaping as someone from Reynolds's network attempted to break into the archive room. With the evidence in hand, they made their way to a safe house preparing to confront Reynolds once and for all. Michael had no illusions about how dangerous this man was, but he was ready to face whatever came next. He had been running for too long. Laura stood by his side, unwavering. She had come to see that, no matter the cost, Michael had a right to his freedom. He had a right to the truth. The confrontation came in the form of a meeting in a dark alley, where they were set to meet an informant who had once worked for Reynolds. As they waited, the air grew thick with tension. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared, tall, imposing, and unmistakably dangerous. Colonel Victor Reynolds. "You're still alive," he said, his voice like gravel, his eyes cold with malice. "I thought I'd gotten rid of you a long time ago." Michael stepped forward, his fists clenched, his face set in grim determination. "I'm not the one who needs to be afraid," Michael said, his voice low but firm. "It's you, Reynolds. You've been hiding the truth for too long, and it ends tonight." Reynolds laughed, his smile twisted and cynical. "You think you can take me down? You have nothing. I own this city. I own your future, Michael." But as he spoke, Laura stepped out from behind Michael, holding up the printed documents, the evidence that would expose everything. "You're finished, Reynolds," she said, her voice clear and confident. "We have everything we need to bring you down." The showdown between Michael and Reynolds was brutal, a battle of wills as much as it was physical. But with Laura's help, they managed to turn the tide. They presented the evidence to the authorities, and soon, Reynolds's entire operation came crumbling down. The people he had manipulated, the lies he had told, all came to light. In the end, Colonel Reynolds was arrested, and the truth about the military operation was exposed to the world. Michael's name was cleared, and justice was finally served. As they walked out of the courthouse, Michael turned to Laura, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it. You saved me," he said softly. "I owe you everything." Laura smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "You don't owe me anything," she replied. "We're family, and we've got each other's backs." With Reynolds in custody, Michael could finally begin to rebuild his life. He no longer had to run, and Laura, for the first time, understood what it meant to truly fight for justice, not just in the courtroom, but in life. The bond between them deepened, a connection forged in the fires of adversity. Michael was no longer just a defendant. He was her father, the man she had saved. And together, they would face whatever came next. As they stood together on the steps of the courthouse, the future seemed uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt full of possibility. The past had been dark, but the road ahead was filled with light, and whatever challenges lay in their path, they would face them together, father and daughter, united by truth and love. This journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories.